Welcome to the latest presentation in UTO Trainings' ongoing series on instructional design. In this session, we will be discussing classical conditioning and its role in learning development. Classical conditioning is a learned reflex or response that is evoked through a stimulus. Ideas of classical conditioning originated from old philosophical theories, but the Russian psychologist Ivan Pavlov was the first to define classical conditioning. Pavlov outlined his theory while conducting research on the digestive system of dogs. In this session on instructional design theory and application, we will discuss how Pavlov's theory of classical conditioning applies to associative learning and how to use the theory in designing your next course. Classical conditioning was first described in 1903 by Pavlov and later studied by John B. Watson, an American psychologist who we will discuss in a later session. It's an automatic, reflexive type of learning that occurs through associations between environmental and natural stimuli. Today, it constitutes one of the two most notable forms of associative learning, i.e., making a new association between occurring events. The other form is operant conditioning that focuses on using either reinforcement or punishment to maximize or minimize a certain behavior. We will also be discussing operant conditioning in a later session. While doing research on the digestive system of dogs, Pavlov encountered a phenomenon he labeled psychic reflexes. His experiment involved the use of a buzzer or metronome and the subsequent presence of a meat powder. He would ring the buzzer and then observe the dog's saliva production at the presence of the food. Over time, however, Pavlov noticed that the dogs would salivate even before the meat powder was presented, as a reaction to the buzzer's sound. This is what brought the idea of a conditioned response to a particular stimulus. In psychology lingo, the meat powder is the unconditioned stimulus, and the dog's salivation is the unconditioned response. Before conditioning is introduced, the food provided to the dog was an unconditional stimulus that caused the dog to salivate, an unconditional response. The buzzer or tuning fork is a neutral stimulus that serves as a bridge until the dog learns to associate it with food. Until the dog makes the association, the stimulus provided no reaction from the dog and hence no response. During conditioning, the neutral stimulus is paired with the unconditioned stimulus. By introducing the unconditioned stimulus, the food, with the neutral stimulus, the tuning fork, an association can be created. After conditioning, the neutral stimulus, now a conditioned stimulus, elicits salivation, now a conditioned response. In other words, the neutral stimulus, the tuning fork, becomes a conditioned stimulus that generates the conditioned response, namely salivation in the dogs. In order to understand how classical conditioning works, it is important to know its basic principles. The unconditioned stimulus is the one that automatically triggers a response. For example, if the smell of food makes us hungry, then the smell is the unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned response is the unintentional reaction that occurs when a person is triggered by the unconditioned stimulus. In the above-mentioned example, it's a feeling of hunger in response to the smell of food. The conditioned stimulus is the neutral signal that, after being paired with the unconditioned stimulus, triggers the conditioned response. So if we repeatedly hear a certain sound together with the smell of the food, then eventually this sound would trigger the conditioned response, hunger. Consequently, this sound would be the conditioned stimulus. The conditioned response is the learned response to the neutral signal, namely the feeling of hunger. The three stages of classical conditioning include before conditioning, during conditioning, and after conditioning. Let's discuss each of these in detail. In before conditioning, the unconditional stimulus generates an unconditional, unlearned, neutral response. During conditioning, a stimulus that produces no response or is neutral is paired with the unconditioned stimulus and becomes a conditioned stimulus. And after conditioning, the conditioned stimulus is associated with the unconditioned stimulus and generates a new conditioned response. The conditioning process consists of acquisition, generalization, and discrimination. Acquisition is the initial stage in classical conditioning in which an association between a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus takes place. For conditioning to occur in most cases, the neutral stimulus needs to come before the unconditioned stimulus. In other words, the tuning fork before the dog's food. The time in between the two stimuli should be about half a second. The tendency to respond to stimuli similar to conditioned stimulus is called generalization. This is where the association between the two is formed and where a neutral stimulus can now be used to get a conditioned response, making the neutral stimulus a conditioned stimulus. Discrimination is the learned ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimulus and other stimuli that do not signal an unconditioned stimulus. In other words, it is possible to train the brain to ignore the conditioning. Classical conditioning can be applied in the classroom for the creation of a pleasant environment to help students overcome their anxieties and fears. For example, if we pair public speaking, which is an anxiety-provoking situation, with pleasant surroundings, then students will eventually learn to stay relaxed and calm during their presentations. Classical conditioning can also be used to set expectations and change students' behaviors. Early behaviorists believed that learned behaviors of various animals could be reduced to mindless mechanisms. However, later behaviorists suggest that animals learn the predictability of a stimulus, or an expectancy or awareness of that stimulus. Pavlov believed that the laws of learning were similar for all animals, therefore a dog and a person were no different in their learning. But later behaviorists suggested that learning is constrained by an animal's biology. Pavlov's work on classical conditioning provided the framework for later behaviorists that we will discuss in future sessions, such as John Watson and B.F. Skinner. In our next session, we will discuss connectionism theory and its role in instructional design. I hope you will be able to join us at that point. For questions about this training or suggestions and questions on other training, you can reach me at christopher.nigel.lee@asu.edu.